Hello, and welcome to the 11th Annual National Webinar on Child Outcomes Data, presented by the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center and Center for IDEA Early Childhood Data Systems. This webinar presents data from federal fiscal year 2020, which states submitted in their 2022 annual performance reports. As in years past, this webinar will show highlights from our analysis of the data states submitted in their annual performance reports for child outcomes. The indicators used in the analyses were Indicator 3 for the Part C infant and toddler programs and Indicator 7 for the Part B Section 619 preschool programs. In this webinar, you will learn about findings from our analysis of the Part C and Part B child outcomes indicators, where to find more information about the analysis, and where to find resources to help you use the outcomes data at the state and local levels. Throughout this webinar, we present the child outcomes data that states collected from around July 1 of 2020 through June 30th of 2021, and which was reported in 2022. As you may know, states first began collecting, analyzing, and reporting outcomes data in 2005. It was at that time that the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, shifted its monitoring focus from compliance to results. They found that just monitoring for compliance to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, requirements had not always resulted in better outcomes for children with disabilities and their families. At the same time, the Federal Office of Management and Budget, OMB, began to hold all federal agencies accountable for results and required all federal agencies to report data that show the extent to which their programs make a difference. If agencies are unable to show positive results, they risk funding cuts. That's why OSEP needs these data to justify funding for Part C and Part B services. Also, outcomes data reporting is part of OSEP's Part C results-driven accountability process. OSEP originally worked with the Early Childhood Outcomes Center, also known as the ECHO Center, to engage affected parties in identifying which outcomes should be measured. Those parties determined that the outcomes to be measured should be functional in nature and integrated across areas of development. Their work resulted in these three targeted outcomes. A, children should have positive social-emotional skills, including social relationships. B, children should acquire and use knowledge and skills, including early language and communication, and for preschoolers, early literacy. And C, children should use appropriate behaviors to meet their needs. In addition to articulating the outcomes themselves, OSEP also worked with the ECHO Center and other assessment experts to determine how programs must show progress. Because of the complexity of children, families, areas of disability, and service systems, it was clear that OSEP must ask more than a yes-no question about whether children made progress as a result of services they received in a Part C or Part B 619 program. Experts said that children might demonstrate several different levels of progress, depending on the trajectory of their development. They concluded with these 5 progress categories. Category A represents some children who do not show improved functioning between program entry and exit, as illustrated by the light green line labeled A on the graph. Category B represents children who demonstrate some improvement in functioning, although without changing their developmental trajectory. See the blue B line on the graph. Category C represents children who improve functioning to the extent that they move closer to age-expected functioning, but without catching up. See the dark green C line. Category D represents children who improve functioning to the extent that they do catch up with their same-aged peers by the time they exit the program. See the orange D line. And finally, Category E represents children who maintain age-expected functioning from program entry to exit, the purple E line. Sometimes people ask how children who are eligible for services can enter the program with age-expected skills, as denoted by Category E. The children reported in Category E are those whose developmental issues affect just 1 or 2 outcome areas, not all 3. These can also be children for whom services mean maintaining use of assistive technology to support age-expected development. Once working partners had defined 3 outcomes and 5 levels of progress, they were re-engaged to identify a succinct metric to summarize the data. This progress yielded these two summary statements. Summary statement 1 is the percent of children who moved closer to age expected functioning while in the program. We calculate the percentage of summary statement 1 by adding the number of children in categories C plus D divided by the total number of children in categories A plus B plus C plus D. Summary statement 2 is the percent of children who exited the program functioning like their same age peers. We calculate the percentage for summary statement 2 by adding the number of children in categories D and E divided by those in all progress categories A plus B plus C plus D plus E. Since 2005, states have measured child outcomes using multiple approaches. For the purposes of describing the National Outcome System, we group these approaches into 4 categories. The Child Outcome Summary Process, or COS process, is a consensus team rating process based on multiple sources of information about a child's functional performance. This is the most frequently used methodology across both Part C and Part B preschool programs. States that are listed as using one tool statewide are those that require a single assessment tool for all children in the state. For example, in California, all preschoolers with IEPs are assessed on the Desired Results Developmental Profile, also known as DRDP. Also included in this category are states that use the Battelle Developmental Inventory, also known as BDI, to collect their outcomes data. This is the second most frequently used approach for both Part C and 619. States that are listed as using the publisher's online system are those that enter item-level data into online assessment platforms like those of the Teaching Strategies Gold assessment or the AEPSI assessment. Item-level data from these systems are combined and analyzed using algorithms designed and maintained by the assessment publishers. This score conversion results in the progress categories and summary statements necessary for federal reporting. States that are listed as Other include those using multiple tools and those using rating processes like the COS, but with different scales. Let's look at how we calculated the national estimate. To determine which states were included in the national estimate, we started by asking 2 fundamental questions about data quality. Number 1, did the data include an adequate number of children? And number 2, did the data stay within expected patterns? To determine the national picture, we calculate the national estimate of the outcomes of children exiting Part C and 619 using a weighted average of state data limited to states that meet our data quality criteria. Please note that the criteria used to identify states to include in the national estimate represent basic criteria for data quality, and they are not sufficient to determine that the data are valid and reliable for all purposes. We define criteria for data completeness and validity. Data from Part C programs are included in the national estimate when at least 28% of Part C exiters from a state's child count are reported in the outcomes data. Data from Part B preschool programs are complete when at least 12% of their count of children ages 3 through 5 is reported in the outcomes data. We set these 2 criteria very low because the goal is to exclude states with so much missing data that we cannot trust the validity of the performance data. Data from both Part C and Part B preschool programs are considered valid when progress category A, those making no progress, is less than 10%, and progress category E, those who maintained age-expected functioning, is less than 65%. We also excluded any state whose child outcomes report reflected greater than 100% of their child count, as this is also an unexpected pattern. We do not include data on states that use sampling methodologies for child outcomes. We exclude these states because we don't have a method for estimating completeness of data. Let's take a closer look at why certain states were excluded from the national estimate. This table here shows how many states were excluded from the 2020 national analysis for various reasons. We started with all 50 states plus the District of Columbia. For Part C, 1 state was excluded in FFY 2020 because they used a sampling method. 4 other states reported outcomes data on fewer than 28% of the children who exited Part C, and 1 state was excluded for unusual patterns of data in the A and E progress categories for Part C. This left 45 states for inclusion in the national analysis for Part C. Now let's look at Part B 619. In FFY 2020, 2 states were excluded because they used a sampling method. No state was excluded because they reported fewer than 12% of their preschool-age child count. 4 states were excluded for unusual patterns in progress categories A and E. In addition, 3 states were excluded since their child outcomes data reflected greater than 100% of their child count. This left 41 states for inclusion in the national analysis for Part B 619. Now let's look at the trends for inclusion in the national analysis. For FFY 2020, 45 states met the data quality criteria for Part C, and 41 states met the criteria for Part B preschool. The solid green line on this graph compares the number of states that met criteria for Part C across the past 13 years. You can see that the number of states has stayed relatively stable over the last few years, with only 1 state fewer meeting the criteria this year compared to last year. The peach-colored line with dashes shows the number of states that met data quality criteria for Part B preschool. Although the number of Part B preschool programs meeting criteria decreased slightly in 2018-19, it has remained stable the last few years. The shift to virtual services during COVID led to challenges assessing young children with disabilities. Challenges included decreased personnel available to conduct assessment protocols that required face-to-face administration, and a lack of staff trained in tools that use family or caregiver interview. These challenges led to a decrease in the number of children who exited with an entry and exit assessment during 2020-21. These data show the decrease in the total number of children reported with outcomes data across all 56 states and territories between 2018-19 and 2020-21. As you can see, there is about a 9% decline in the total number of children reported for both Part C and Part B preschool. Here are the national estimates for child outcomes data based on the criteria discussed earlier. Starting with Part C, Summary Statement 1, in the area of social relationships, we see that 66% of children substantially increased their rate of growth by program exit. For knowledge and skills, it was 71%, and for taking action to meet needs, it was 70%. Now let's look at Part C's Summary Statement 2. 53% of children in Part C were functioning within age expectations in social relationships by the time they exited the program. Knowledge and skills was 44%, and for taking action to meet needs was 51%. Moving over to Part B preschool, we see that 78% of exiting children substantially increased their rate of growth in the area of social relationships, 79% for knowledge and skills, and 79% for taking action to meet needs. And finally, for Summary Statement 2, for Part B preschool, the percentage of children functioning within age expectations by the time they exited the program was 56% in the area of social relationships, 52% for knowledge and skills, and 61% for taking action to meet needs. We can see a fuller picture by looking at the data over time. This slide shows trends in child outcomes national estimates across the last 9 years for infants and toddlers exiting Part C programs. The lowest percentage of children making greater than expected growth has consistently been in the outcome of social relationships, represented by the green line in the chart on the left. The lowest percentage of children exiting at or above age expectations has consistently been in the outcome of knowledge and skills, represented by the orange dotted line in the chart on the right. Comparing FFY19 to FFY20 shows increases in some outcomes and decreases in others. There was an increase in the percentage of children making greater than expected progress in social relationships and knowledge and skills, and an increase in the percent of children exiting at or above age expectations in social relationships. There was no change in percent of children exiting at or above age expectations in knowledge and skills. For the third outcome, taking actions to meet needs, there was a decrease in both the percent of children making greater than expected growth and percent of children exiting at or above age expectations. Now let's look at the trends for Part B 619 preschool programs. This slide shows trends in child outcomes across the last 9 years for children exiting Part B preschool programs. Prior to FFY20, the percentage of children who made greater than expected growth while in the Part B preschool programs had been quite stable and similar across all outcomes, as seen in the chart on the left. However, between FY19 and FY20, there was a decrease in all three outcomes. Now look at the percent of children exiting at or above age expectations in the chart on the right. In the last few years prior to FY20, there had been a decline in all three outcomes. This trend continued slightly in FY20 in knowledge and skills and taking action to meet needs. However, this trend reversed in social relationships, which saw an increase in FY20. States reported several key reasons for changes in Part C and 619 performance, including changes to state data collection methods, potential impacts of COVID-19, and other data quality issues. Further analyses are needed, particularly at the state and local levels, to understand these trends. Next, we will look at the variation across states in the completeness of their child outcomes data and performance for Part C and Part B 619. As mentioned previously, the national estimates take into consideration the completeness of each state's data. This slide shows the variation in completeness for Part C child outcomes data. We calculate completeness by dividing the total number reported for Outcome 1 by the total number of children who exited Part C during the reporting year. We include states in the national estimate that report at least 28% of total number of children who exited Part C during the reporting year. For FFY 2020, completeness ranged from 11% to 81%, with a median of 57%. States may be reporting fewer than 28% of exiters for several reasons, including sampling and rolling out a new method of collecting child outcomes data. This chart shows the variation in completeness for states' Part B 619 preschool programs. For preschool, we calculate completeness by dividing the total number of children reported in the outcomes data by the total number of children ages 3 to 5 in the Part B child count. Starting in FFY 2020, states are reporting a separate total for 5-year-olds in kindergarten. This led to a systematic decrease in the denominator for this completeness percentage, as it now represents only 3, 4, and 5-year-olds in preschool, and not 5-year-olds in kindergarten. We include states in the national analysis that report child outcomes data on at least 12% of their child count. In FFY 2020, 3 states reported outcomes data on more than 100% of their child count, and we excluded these 3 states from the national analysis. Completeness ranged from 0% to 147%, with a median of 48%. Now let's look at state variation in performance on Outcome 2, Summary Statement 2, the percent of children who exited at age expectations in the outcome of knowledge and skills. We see quite a bit of variation in performance on this outcome across states. Notice the wide range of performance, from 8% to 69% of infants and toddlers exiting at age expectations in knowledge and skills. The median performance was 43%. Reasons for potential performance across states include differences in assessment tools used to measure performance, restrictiveness of eligibility criteria, or other differences in the population served by the state, and the quality of services provided. Now let's look at the percent of children who exited Part B preschool programs functioning at age expectations in the outcome of knowledge and skills. Again, we see a wide range across states, from 16% to 69%. The median performance was 48%. In short, we see important variation across states in child outcomes performance. Let's use data to evaluate the prediction that states with narrower eligibility criteria will have fewer children exiting at age expectations. In the figure shown here, notice the difference between State 1 and State 2 in the percentage of children who exited within age expectations. Why might State 1 have a greater proportion of their children exiting at age expectations? One explanation may be that State 1 serves a higher percentage of their overall population in this age group than State 2. States that serve higher percentages of their population are usually serving proportionately more children with milder delays or disabilities. It stands to reason that children with milder delays or disabilities are more likely to exit within age expectations, compared with children who have more severe delays or disabilities. In the next slide, we will look more closely at the differences in child outcomes across states by percentage of their overall population. Here, we categorize states into 3 groups according to the proportion of their overall population ages 0 to 3 served in Part C to determine whether there were differences. This slide shows results for children who exited Part C within age expectations. The green bars represent the 15 states that served fewer than 2.5% of their overall infant and toddler population. Purple bars represent the 23 states that served between 2.5 and 3.9% of their infant-toddler population. And the blue bars represent the 13 states that served greater than 3.9% of their overall infant and toddler population. The data pattern is as we would expect for all 3 outcome areas, meaning that states that served a smaller percent of their population reported lower percentages of children exiting within age expectations. This is especially clear when you compare the states in the green bar with states in the blue bar. Now let's see if this same pattern holds true for Part B preschool programs. The green bars represent the 19 states that served fewer than 4% of their preschool age population. Purple bars represent the 22 states that served between 4 to 6% of their preschool age population, and the blue bars represent the 10 states that served greater than 6% of their preschool age population. Across all 3 outcomes, the percentage of children exiting within age expectations shows very little difference based on the percentage of the overall preschool age population served. In fact, within the outcome areas of social relationships and actions to meet needs, results only vary by about 1 to 2 percentage points across the 3 groups. And in the area of knowledge and skills, the summary statement percentage is lowest for states serving more than 6% of their overall preschool age population. In short, the Part B 619 results do not follow the expected pattern we saw within Part C. We do not currently have an alternative hypothesis to explain this pattern for Part B 619, but states may wish to use other data available to them in order to dig deeper. To assist states in their ongoing review of child outcomes data, the DAISY Center creates unique child outcomes data reports for each state every year. This report is called the State Child Outcomes Data Quality Profile. This profile will help you review different aspects of data quality for your child outcomes. These reports are sent from the ECTA liaisons to each Part C and Part B 619 coordinator every year when they are completed. If you haven't received a report, please reach out to your ECTA or DAISY contact. Let's take a peek inside the Child Outcomes Data Quality Profiles. Here you see a few examples of charts contained in a state's data quality profile. These reports contain valuable graphics and tables that can be used to identify trends in state performance and data quality issues that may require further exploration. The information can be easily shared with a variety of audiences. For example, charts can be pasted into state documents and presentation materials. Please contact your ECTA or DAISY liaison if you have questions or would just like to chat about your data. Here are some further resources on the ECTA and DAISY Center websites to support your child outcomes measurement work, including a 2-page summary of the 2020 IDEA Child Outcomes Highlights, a map of approaches to child outcomes measurement across the country, guidance on how to use your child outcomes data quality profile, a document with practical strategies to examine the impact of COVID on your data quality and performance, and a resource to help stakeholders ask questions to help understand year-to-year changes in child outcomes data. Here are even more resources, including an infographic that depicts the breadth of the functional skills that are included in each of the 3 outcomes, practice scenarios for the child outcome summary process that provide an opportunity for staff using the COS to practice ratings and compare their ratings to the correct rating for the scenario, guidance for age anchoring to determine child outcome summary ratings, and a collection of even more professional development resources for the COS process. If you have any questions or feedback, please contact the DAISY and ECTA staff listed here. For more information about the ECTA and DAISY centers, please visit our websites at the addresses listed here. This concludes our presentation. Thanks for your interest in child outcomes, and have a great day.